My name is Denise Abdul-Rahman, and I serve as the National NAACP staff through the leadership of Senior Director Jacqueline Patterson and the National Environmental Climate Justice Board Chair for Environmental Climate Justice, Kathy Eglin. I also serve as the Indiana State Conference Environmental Climate Justice Chair. The Environmental Climate Justice Program has three core objectives. We want to reduce harmful emissions, particularly greenhouse gases. For example, polluting systems like coal-fired power plants and natural gas plants that emit toxins such as methane and harm our health and water, soil, and air, and impact our climate, our planet. Number two, we want to advance clean energy and energy efficiency, such as the two projects that we launched this year, a solar project in Evansville and a LED light project in Hammond. And three, we want to strengthen our community's resilience and livability, such as the right to live free of polluting systems, and demonstrate and advocate and protest to stop harm and bring in the good without the fear of criminalization of our rights to free speech. I would like to quickly display a model called the Just Transition Frame. And it's all about stopping the extractive economy, everything that takes from our communities and our communities' well-being, and moving to building the new, or to a more caring and sacred place for our communities to regenerate and to have deep democracy. In other words, we want to move the capital to shift economic control to communities, democratize wealth and the workplace, advance ecological restoration, drive racial justice and social equity, relocalize most production and consumption, and retain, restore cultures and traditions. This frame was created, developed by Movement Generation with the Our Power campaign, of which the NAACP is a stark member. So now, the Criminal Justice and Environmental Climate Justice Committees are collaborating today to present a phenomenal webinar on the intersections of police reform and environmental climate justice. And I would now like to turn it over to President Joseph Anderson, Criminal Justice Chair of the Indiana State Conference of the NAACP.
Thank you, Denise. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning presentation. I am Joseph Anderson. I am the State Criminal Justice Chair for Indiana's NAACP. I also serve in the role as the Muncie Branch President. So it's an honor to be on this, be working with Denise on this presentation this morning. And she actually reached out to me about a week and a half ago to talk about collaborating on doing this. And I believe Carlton Myers had reached out to her. So we had the opportunity to discuss how this would go in regards to combining the two together. And we had a really good conversation. So I like to give kudos to Ms. Abdul-Rahman in regards to her suggesting this and making it happen. Also like to thank the committee as well as Barbara Bowling Williams for their support in doing this. As you know, the NAACP advocates for smarter, result-based criminal justice policies to keep our communities safe, including treatment of addiction and mental health problems, judicial discretion in sentencing, and to end and an end to racial disparities at all levels of the system. As you know, we've had some challenging times around the country the past couple of years. A lot of things have transpired. So I believe you're going to be excited. You're going to get a lot of good information. Just the time I got to speak to Mr. Mayers, I think we talked for about an hour. He had a lot of stuff that he shared. So what I would like to do is to read his bio. Has the founder, owner, and head consultant from Mayers Strategic Solutions, LLC. Carlton T. Mayers II, Esquire, consults with communities nationwide to identify strategies and implement long-term and positive change in police practices, policies, and culture throughout the CAT method to achieve community empowerment centered policy reform. He also leads criminal justice reform programs at Heartland Advance in Illinois as the senior policy manager. He received his JD and master's in environmental law and policy from Vermont Law School and his bachelor science in neuroscience and behavior biology from Emory University. Prior to joining Heartland Alliance, Mr. Mayers directed the Southern Law Poverty Center Criminal Justice Reform Program in Florida and worked for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund Incorporation in Washington, D.C., his policy counsel for the Policing Reform Campaign. He directed the National Criminal Justice Reform Program at the NAACP National Office in Baltimore, Maryland, and co-authored the NAACP Born Suspect Racial Profiling Report, published in 2014. Throughout his career, Mr. Mayers advocated across the country for the application of national best practices to state and local advocacy of criminal justice reform, including supporting advocacy efforts in Ferguson, Missouri, Baltimore, Maryland, North Charleston, South Carolina, and New York City. Carlton was born and raised in New York City. Everyone, please, I will turn it over now to Carlton Mayers.
Thank you very much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off my video because I have some really good slides I put together for everybody, and I want you to focus on the slides. So give me 1 minute while I do that. Okay, everybody can see the slides? Can I just get a nod? Thank you very much. Okay. So, good morning, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak with you today about the intersections between policing reform and environmental/climate justice. Through my consulting company, Mayers Strategic Solutions, LLC, we work with communities across the country on reimagining public safety by establishing their own policing reforms centered on community empowerment through an approach that I developed and informed by my years of experience as a community lawyer called the CAT method, which stands for C for community empowerment, A for accountability, and T for transparency. In the aftermath of the tragic police killings of Breonna Floyd and Daniel Prude, and the unjustified shooting of Jacob Blake, there is once again increased public awareness and attention to police violence against people, especially persons of color, which has caused a decline in the public's confidence in law enforcement and galvanized a call. However, there will not be true police accountability until the underlying issue of policing is addressed. What is this issue? Well, this issue is the power disparity that exists between law enforcement, who are tasked to protect and serve their communities, and community members whose taxpayer dollars pay for law enforcement salaries and pensions. In this relational dynamic, law enforcement can use lethal force without accountability on a community member who simply makes quote unquote furtive movements. But due to qualified immunity, community members are not even able to sue individual officers for alleged misconduct. To this end, this power disparity must be balanced, and communities must be empowered to change law enforcement policies, practices, and culture in order to eradicate police misconduct and establish sustainable and long-standing policing reform. This is important because ultimately, community members and law enforcement need to work together as one community to support public safety and ensure police accountability. And this connects directly to environmental/climate justice efforts to create and cultivate healthy and safe communities for everyone. Considering white supremacy's dehumanization of Black, Indigenous, and people of color through sacrifice zones, which are areas deemed permissible to pollute so that other areas can flourish with little to no pollution. Based on what environmental advocacy groups have written about sacrifice zones, the richest people need for white supremacy to remain invisible so they can continue to plunder our planet. They need sacrifice zones and the racism that justifies these sacrifice zones, not only targeting impoverished areas and people, but especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Or they'll have nowhere to put their trash and pollution. Similarly, we've also recently seen this dehumanization of Black, Indigenous, and people of color play out in, for instance, George Floyd's death in Minnesota, where every one of those law enforcement officers watching George Floyd die was convinced that the man pinned to the ground was less than human and was in some way disposable. And in Breonna Taylor's death in Kentucky, where there was an improper use of a no-knock warrant and the lack of prosecution of the involved officers in her unjustified death. And finally, the actions and rhetoric of right-wing extremist white supremacist groups like the Proud Boys. More specifically, looking at policing in America through a historical lens, we need to talk about the so-called Black laws, were laws governing the conduct of free Black Americans. The most well-known of them were passed in 1865 and 1866 by Southern states after the Civil War in order to restrict Black Americans' freedom and to force them to work for low wages. Before the Civil War, Northern states that had prohibited slavery also enacted Black codes to discourage free Black Americans from residing in those states. They were denied equal political rights, including the right to vote, the right to attend public schools, and the right to equal treatment under the law. The defining feature of the Black codes were broad vagrancy laws, which allowed local authorities, also known as law enforcement, to arrest freed people for minor infractions and commit them to involuntary labor. This period was the start of the convict lease system, which is the birth of mass incarceration in the US today. Fast forwarding to contemporary times, there are still challenges in, as you can see here on the slide, persons shot and killed by police nationwide in 2019. So all the information I'm about to provide on this slide is on the Washington Post website. So in 2019, there were 999 persons shot and killed by police nationwide. Black people were 25%. That's 250 of 999 of those killed, despite being only 13% of the overall US population. Additionally, the racial disparity is even more pronounced among unarmed victims shot and killed by police. 55 people out of 999 killed by police were unarmed, and 14 of them were Black people. So that means 25% of unarmed people who were shot and killed by police in 2019 were Black people. Lastly, 21% of people, that's 214 of 999, had a mental illness and were shot and killed by police. We also know that according to a sociological study that was published in 2016, that immediately following And for more than a year after the highly publicized assault or death of a Black person at the hands of police, Black Americans are less likely to dial 911. All of this demonstrates that not ensuring police accountability does not support public safety. So now let's talk about how this connects to environmental/climate justice. Considering the current COVID-19 pandemic and all the ill effects of global climate change, driven in large part by the pollution from fossil fuel companies, also known as gas and oil companies, and utility companies, there is a health crisis in the US that disproportionately impacts Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And as you can see here on this slide, it says anti-protest legislation and police foundations. So let's talk about how these two things connect to this issue. According to federal data, in the past 10 years, more than 80,000 miles of major new pipelines, like interstate gas transmission lines and oil pipelines, have been constructed nationwide. These pipelines tend to be laid under Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities and have an adverse disproportionate impact on them, since the construction of these pipelines and leaks in the pipelines contaminate the soil and the groundwater supply. As a result, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities play a significant role in opposing new pipelines and the construction of them. For example, the best known of these protests is the Standing Rock protests in North Dakota in 2016 through 2017, which involved thousands of Indigenous people and environmental activists protesting the construction of a pipeline through Indigenous land. Following the Standing Rock protests, there were numerous public protests after Trump's election and during his presidency. Some of these are still ongoing, and a multitude of protests in response to several high-profile officer-involved deaths, such as the 2016 killings of Philando Castile in Minnesota and Alton Sterling in Louisiana. In response to these protests, state legislators began trying to pass laws that would limit the First Amendment right to free speech of protesters. A wave of state anti-protest legislation called Critical Infrastructure Protection legislation began in 2016 and 2017, designed to criminalize protests specifically related to oil and gas projects and enhance the penalties for activists planning protests of oil and gas pipelines and other critical infrastructure. So this term, critical infrastructure protection, is actually being deceptively used by state legislators, since this term refers to safeguarding vital infrastructure like roads and bridges from dangers like natural disasters, terrorism, and cyber attacks. In other words, critical infrastructure protection was not meant to safeguard fossil fuel companies, incinerators, utility companies, and other polluting facilities. Generally, critical infrastructure protection bills consist of similar elements. According to Greenpeace, these elements are, number one, they create new criminal penalties for already illegal conduct. For example, changing misdemeanor trespass into a felony. Number two, they broadly redefine the term critical infrastructure to not only include fossil fuel pipelines, but also everything from cell phone towers to trucking terminals. And number three, the bills also seek to create liability for organizations that support protesters by treating such support as a criminal conspiracy. At first, most of these bills were struck down for being blatantly unconstitutional. However, in 2018, the right-wing lobbyist organization called the American Legislative Exchange Council, also known as ALEC, which has strong connections to both private prisons and the fossil fuel industry, created and promoted the original template bill version of the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, which has been replicated and introduced in numerous states. And fossil fuel companies like Marathon Petroleum and ExxonMobil and the notorious Koch Industries are the three most active companies involved in lobbying for the passage of critical infrastructure protection laws across the country. To date, as you can see on this slide, 16 states have enacted similar critical infrastructure protection legislation, and close to half of all states are considering such laws. Likewise, since the 2016 protests, there was also an increase in anti-protest legislation related to protesters blocking roadways and highways. For example, Florida's Governor DeSantis is trying to get a law passed that would make felonies out of participating in protests that result in property damage or blocking roads, and anyone who organizes or donates money to protesters would risk liability under the state's racketeering laws. Additionally, for violators of this law, it would require a mandatory minimum of 6 months in jail, the loss of benefits like food stamps or unemployment assistance, and ineligibility for employment by state and local governments. Moreover, this law would prohibit defendants from posting bail before their first court appearance if they are charged with a crime related to a violent or disorderly assembly. In other words, they would be guilty until proven innocent. But most egregious is that this law would provide immunity for motorists from vehicular manslaughter when people are illegally blocking roadways and/or highways, when there is no permit for the protest, and if motorists are fleeing for safety from a mob. Essentially, this would grant protections to people who drive cars into crowds of protesters, even if someone is injured or killed. And lastly, Blue Lives Matter legislation is another tool that can be used to criminalize First Amendment protests related to law enforcement engaging with protesters. State legislatures are responding to calls for policing reform by proposing Blue Lives Matter legislation, offering an empty political statement rather than needed reform to improve safe and constitutional policing. There are two types of Blue Lives Matter legislation that aim to enlarge penalties for crimes committed against law enforcement, and both are counterproductive to support public safety. The first type amends existing state hate crime statutes to categorize law enforcement officers as protected groups, including them with victims who were targeted with bias-motivated crimes based on race, color, religion, sexual orientation, disability, or the second type enhances sentencing penalties and in some cases denies pretrial bail for certain crimes committed against law enforcement. Overall, all of these different types of anti-protest legislation just add another layer of criminalization to Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, and could ultimately result in the censorship of peaceful protests. So now we're going to transition from anti-protest legislation to police foundations. So let's talk about police foundations. First, these organizations are typically set up as nonprofits and raise funds for law enforcement agencies, collecting donations from individuals, local businesses, and national sponsors. That money is then used to fund projects for the law enforcement agencies, including acquiring surveillance technology, military-style equipment and weaponry, and related trainings. This funding comes on top of the $100 billion spent nationally on policing every year. Major cities in the US typically spend anywhere from 20 to 45% of their general budgets on law enforcement agencies. These police foundations can purchase equipment and weapons with little to no public input or oversight, and there are numerous barriers to transparency and information access of police foundations. Some benefits of a nonprofit police foundation are the tax-exempt status of the organization and limited liability of founders, directors, members, and staff. Another benefit of police foundations is the increased secrecy these legal arrangements provide to law enforcement officials, effectively allowing transactions to happen behind closed doors. Lastly, these police foundations provide a public-private structure wherein the corporate elite can overtly support law enforcement agencies through direct donations, sponsorships, special programs, and by serving as directors on the police foundations boards. Police foundations are a key space for orchestrating, normalizing, and celebrating the collaboration between corporate power and law enforcement. In fact, a 2014 report showed that companies that sell services to law enforcement usually donate to police foundations. For example, as nonprofit organizations, police foundations not only bolster law enforcement budgets, they are separate from the public contract procurement process. In the same vein, technology companies like Motorola and Raytheon provide donations to support police foundations in the hopes of later winning contracts in the public contract procurement process. So essentially, this is a I scratch your back and you scratch mine relationship. The corporate interests backing police foundations across the country come from a wide range of industries and include, as you can see here on the slide, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, BlackRock, Target, Google, and Microsoft. This commingling of private and privatized security with public law enforcement is a key feature of police foundation networks. Not surprisingly, fossil fuel and utility companies also fund law enforcement through police foundations. For instance, Chevron, Halliburton, and Hillcore Energy all have seats on the Houston Police Foundation board. And both DTE Energy, a major utility company, and Marathon Petroleum, one of the biggest refiners in the US, donate to the Detroit Public Safety Foundation and have seats on this board as well. So this picture that you see on this slide is based on research from ProPublica and LittleSis.org, who were able to trace some of the direct connections between local police foundations and corporate America. Fossil fuel companies, including Chevron, Shell, and Marathon Petroleum, have funded the police foundations in Seattle, Chicago, New Orleans, Salt Lake City, and Washington, D.C., in addition to other cities. And publicly traded utility companies such as Exelon, Entergy, and Duke Energy all have connections to these police foundations as well. The conflicts of interest between these police foundations' corporate sponsors and the technology, equipment, and training they are purposefully providing for local law enforcement agencies has left us with an increasingly militarized law enforcement that works under the mandate of unaccountable corporate donors. Essentially, law enforcement acts as personal security for the corporate donors of police foundations. So I know I've just provided a global context of how anti-protest legislation and police foundations relate to this issue. But now I would like to hone in on how it applies specifically to Indiana. So as you can see here on the slide, it says anti-protest legislation in Indiana, Senate Bill 471. So SB 471 was introduced and passed into law last year in 2019 and is now Indiana's critical infrastructure protection law. This law provides that an individual who knowingly enters a critical infrastructure facility without permission commits critical infrastructure facility trespass, which is a felony punishable by up to 30 months in prison. Also, under this law, recklessly or knowingly defacing such a facility constitutes critical infrastructure facility mischief, which is a felony punishable by up to 6 years in prison. Additionally, the law newly defines critical infrastructure facility under Indiana law to include a range of oil, gas, electric, water, telecommunications, and railroad facilities, as well as any facility that is substantially similar to one of the listed facilities. Now, I know that NAACP Indiana State Conference opposes this law and provided testimony against it before it was passed into law, which I think is awesome. So now, looking at police foundations in Indiana, according to my research, I've only been able to find 4 police foundations that are currently operational in Indiana, and I'm gonna list them here for you. First, we have the Central Indiana Police Foundation, which covers the Indianapolis area. Then there's the Fishers Police Foundation, which covers the Fishers Police Department. Next, there is the Indy Public Safety Foundation, which also covers the Indianapolis area, but includes all first responders, which means firefighters, law enforcement, and EMT. And then lastly, the Evansville Police Foundation, which is for the Evansville Police Department located in Southern Indiana. Now, in regards to the Evansville Police Foundation, I did a little bit of digging and research to see who's on the board of this police foundation. And I noticed that there were representatives from the utility company CenterPoint Energy, and also Field and Main Bank, and Old National Bank. I do think it could be worth looking into CenterPoint Energy's role with law enforcement, considering that the utility company is located right outside of Evansville, I believe about 30 miles outside of it. So at this point, what are the solutions? Well, considering all of this, first, in regards to Indiana's Critical Infrastructure Protection Law, SB 471, the first thing is to monitor implementation of this law for violations of constitutional rights that could result in potential litigation. I know that currently ACLU file lawsuits in Louisiana and South Dakota related to similar laws. Second is to amend the law, to take away its teeth in hopes of making it unenforceable. So that way it's a law on the books with no power. And lastly, the best case scenario is to repeal the law, to get it off the books completely so it does not exist anymore. So what about police foundations, right? Well, I know earlier I said that I work with communities across the country on reimagining public safety through community empowerment-centered policing reform. And the vehicle for community empowerment-centered policing reform method. And as you can see here, the CAP method consists of 3 components: community empowerment, accountability, and transparency. Each component needs to be achieved in order for the CAP method to be successful. So in regards to the community empowerment component, this entails community members being involved in, having knowledge of, and having at least 50% voting power over. I'm gonna repeat that. Having at least 50% voting power over all police activities directly related to police-civilian interactions. So this includes stops, arrests, searches, uses of force, etc. Another important piece of the community empowerment component is that community members who are from the neighborhoods and communities that have high levels of negative police interactions, like racial profiling, excessive use of force, and sexual misconduct. Those community members especially need to have involvement in, knowledge of, and at least 50% voting power over all police activities directly related to police-civilian interactions. In regards to the accountability component, this involves creating an inhospitable environment for unfit officers. And then lastly, the transparency component I define as the interconnectedness and coordination amongst community members, law enforcement, elected and appointed government officials, and the news media working together as one community to support public safety and ensure police accountability through more so proactive rather than reactive strategies. So how does this apply to police foundations more specifically? Well, number one, we want to make sure to end the use of law enforcement as personal security for corporate donors of police foundations. And how this can be done with the CAP method is, in regards to the community empowerment component, this would, for example, establish a community process that would involve a civilian governing board, such as the Civilian Oversight Authority, that would consist of community members from the neighborhoods in the community with high levels of negative police interactions. This civilian governing board would have at least 50% voting power over all police activities directly related to police-civilian interactions. And the civilian governing board would be involved in how the funds from police foundations are spent, would have knowledge of who is on the police foundation's board, how much money the police foundation is providing to the law enforcement agency, and how the funds will be used. So in regards to the accountability and transparency components, I'm actually going to speak on the transparency component first. This would involve safeguards that would be established through law or memorandum of understanding with law enforcement and the government that would require that funds from police foundations cannot be used for military-style equipment and weaponry, surveillance technology, and discriminatory policing tactics like stop and frisk and other forms of racial profiling. The transparency component would also include safeguards that would be established through law or memorandum of understanding with law enforcement and the government that would require or incentivize law enforcement agencies to use the funds from police foundations to assist their communities to reimagine public safety, to demilitarize law enforcement, to subsidize restorative justice programs to be alternatives to incarceration, and to subsidize trauma-informed care and unarmed responses for wellness checks and in-crisis incidents, including situations related to mental health and substance abuse. And then lastly, the accountability component would be established through a law or a memorandum of understanding with law enforcement and the government that would establish a public reporting requirement of who is on the Police Foundation's board, how much money the Police Foundation is providing to the law enforcement agency, and how the funds will be used. This information would be accessible on the law enforcement agency's website and at the law enforcement agency station, and on the municipal government's website and at City Hall. There would also be a public comment period for at least a month to allow community members to provide their feedback on this information, and all public comments would be publicly accessible. This way, community members can hold their law enforcement agencies accountable when it comes to funds they receive from police foundations. So now, wrapping it all up, this is the what. These are the consulting services for state and local legislative and grassroots advocacy, all provided through my company, my consulting company, and all done through the CAP method that I just detailed. And then lastly, this is the how, my contact information. Although I did a simplistic and quick run through of reimagining public safety through community empowerment-centered policing reform to address the intersections between policing reform and environmental/climate justice by applying the CAP method to police foundations, I also provide a more in-depth presentation on the CAP method, and I'm finalizing a strategy workshop on applying the CAP method to the 21st Century Policing Task Force final report recommendations. So thank you, and please do keep in touch.
Thank you so much, Carlton, for that extremely informative presentation. And now we can take questions. If you can please place your questions in the in the chat box. And it looks like our first question is from President Wesley Scully of Michigan City Branch. And he says that one of the biggest pieces of legislation the police use to get away with murder is called qualified immunity. How do we take that protection away?
So right now, I know that there are a number of states like Colorado, for instance, that have addressed this issue through state legislation to make sure that law enforcement, individual law enforcement officers are held liable in civil court when they engage in misconduct, like, excessive use of force, et cetera. What I would say is that the best thing to do is to try to replicate what states like Colorado have done and really push your state legislators to try to get a similar law passed in Indiana. I know that in Illinois, they're doing that. They're looking at, I think they've already introduced a few bills that would do that in Illinois, and that would essentially require that all law enforcement officers, including the police chief, would have to take out their own personal insurance, I believe of up to anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000. So that way they would be able to essentially be liable for their own misconduct instead of having the city or the state take on that liability. So that really needs to be done through state legislation. Outside of that, I would say it would have to get done through the courts and mainly through the Supreme Court because there's Supreme Court precedent law for that. But that's something that's more of a federal matter. So.
Thank you.
We have a question from Valerie Craig. Her question is, has any anti-protest legislation been passed in Indiana? And then her second question is, why aren't we defining and fighting qualified immunity more across the nation? Understanding this makes it feel that our protests are focused on the wrong thing, because what we are demanding, in parentheses, stop killing us, can never happen if rogue cops will just gain immunity at the end.
So I agree. And well, number one, the anti-protest legislation that was passed in Indiana in 2019, that was what I laid out earlier, Senate Bill 471, that's the critical infrastructure protection legislation. And I believe that Denise can probably give you more information on that because like I mentioned earlier, Indiana State Conference did provide testimony against that particular law. So I know that specifically for Indiana, there's a lot of information that NAACP in Indiana has on that. So in regards to qualified immunity, in my opinion, I think that's one piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of different factors that tie into police accountability. Also in regards to, like, for instance, use of force reporting, we want to make sure that we have knowledge on all police civilian interactions. Something that Roy Austin, who is the author of the 21st Century Policing Task Force, something he used to always say is that police data belongs to the community. And I agree with that. And at the end of the day, we're not going to be able to have accountability until we know exactly what is going on in communities. In other words, you're not going to be able to solve a problem until you know what the problem is. So I do believe that qualified immunity is one piece, but that's not going to be the panacea that is going to solve police accountability if we were to do away with it or undo qualified immunity. There's a lot of different factors. And that's why I push for community empowerment centered policing reform, because community members need to be at the table. They need to have at least that 50% voting power over all police activities that are directly related to police civilian interactions. Because at the end of the day, as we've seen with the pandemic, things change. I mean, that's life. That's the way it works. The environment changes, circumstances changes, presidents change, right? Governors change, state assemblies change. And we want to make sure that the policing reforms are able to adapt with those changes, but still align with what the community members want to see in their community and their values. And that's why reimagining public safety for community empowerment centered policing reform, in my opinion, is not only going to address qualified immunity, but is going to address the full picture of police accountability for long-term sustainable policing reform.
Thank you so much. We have about 15 minutes left. And so we have just a comment here, a question from President Reverend Arnold of Evansville. And he just wants to make sure that the information from this session can be sent to branch presidents. So this is being recorded through YouTube and live stream, and then we can check with Attorney Mayers to see if he wants to be able to share his slides specifically. And then we have Don Briggs, who is asking, have you seen any success among neighborhood associations driving ACT locally, bottom up?
Yes, I mean, we've seen this all across the country. A good example is in Austin, Texas. I want to say maybe a few years ago, there was a community-based organization there called the Austin Justice Coalition, who was very successful in making sure that community members had a seat at the table during the negotiations of the collective bargaining agreement of law enforcement. In other words, police union contracts. And if we're going to talk about accountability, we got to talk about those union contracts. And the reason I'm bringing them up is because initially they started off by just having community members attend in person those negotiations of those collective bargaining agreements. And then by working with their city council and with their mayor, they were able to eventually have a seat at the table where they are also negotiating with the government and the police union on those police union contract provisions that relate to discipline, investigations of misconduct, all of those things, disciplinary records, all of those things that have a direct impact on police civilian interactions. And to me, that's something that is a model for what should be and really, could be and should be done all across the country. But there's also efforts in Wisconsin, Milwaukee in particular. They have a civilian complaint review board called the Fire and Police Commission that's been around for a very long time. It's actually one of the oldest civilian oversight authorities in the country. And they have both the authority to review civilian complaints of law enforcement and have investigatory powers where they can subpoena officers and others who are involved in the incident during their investigation, and disciplinary powers where they can actually advance discipline based on the results of the investigation. In addition to that, like let's say, for instance, the police chief has disciplines a rank and file officer for misconduct. If that officer wants to appeal their case, it goes before the Fire and Police Commission. Like I said, that's their Civilian Complaint Review Board. So they don't only have accountability mechanisms that are within the police department having to do with like the police chief and appeals of a police chief decision, but also external accountability mechanisms in regards to reviewing those civilian complaints and having the investigatory powers and the disciplinary powers. And so I look at those examples and others. I mean, there's so many. Even here in Indiana, the work that Denise is doing, I think, speaks to that as well, and President Anderson. There's so much work happening on the ground locally that we may not hear about, but it's still happening and it's pushing the ball forward. So I just gave you 2 examples, but there's so much work happening all around the country.
President Anderson, I'll answer this one, and then if you can do the next one, please. Have Deborah Smiley, she asked, how can we get involved in urging our legislators to amend or repeal Senate Bill 471? Are there letter templates or the like to send out? And so we hope that you will join your local Environmental Climate Justice Committee. For example, Valerie Hart Craig, who answered a question here, is ECJ of Terre Haute. We have ECJ chairs in Gary, Evansville, all over the state. And so with that, we can certainly talk about it as a committee. It's a great idea. And we can pass a resolution today if we want that calls on all of our branches to do just that. So thanks for that question, Deborah Smiley.
Mr. Russ, at the current laws that they're trying to pass, is that something we must contact the State House about? And this may not be something that we could answer, but what is the push on death penalty going on and who is getting kickbacks from this?
Well, the second part, I'm not going to be able to answer. I'm not a death penalty expert. There are other people that are doing great work on that, though. So I want to give kudos to them. Now, in regards to the legislative piece, like I mentioned earlier, the bill was already passed into law. And so those 3 different solutions that I provided, meaning that you have to, number 1, look at the implementation of the law. So once somebody has violated it, that case needs to be followed. I know that, like I mentioned earlier, ACLU is already doing this in Louisiana and South Dakota, and they filed lawsuits based on that law, and people who have come under the law have been, considered to violate it and are now facing charges for that. The other piece is and this is more of a legislative advocacy approach, not a litigation or a legal advocacy approach, would be to try to amend the law. Now that you can do by working with your lawmakers, and this is where lobbying, right? And that's why it's important to vote and to get people in office that can be your champion, that can actually advocate for your values and what you want to see, and making sure to hold them accountable and work with them. So that way they can champion that kind of amendment and change in the state assembly. And then the last thing, which would be the best case scenario, would be to repeal the law altogether. Now, that might be a huge lift and it might take a long-term haul, but in the end, it's going to be worth it to get this law that's really going to criminalize Black and Indigenous and people of color specifically, to get that off of the books.
Thank you once again, Attorney Carlton Mayers. We really appreciate your being here and sharing at our very first Indiana State Conference virtual convening. So I just really applaud you for all of your information that you provided us and all that you're moving across the nation. Now we will turn to just some brief closing remarks from President Anderson, and followed by myself in respect to our respective committees, the Criminal Justice and Environmental Climate Justice Committee.
I would first like to thank everyone for joining. There were good questions that were asked. Wish we had more time to get more into this. Would love the opportunity to work with Carlton more. I have talked to him about bringing him to Muncie to help us out. The NAACP here, we have partnered with other organizations And we have been trying to address some of these issues with our police department. You have to get involved. You have to hold people accountable from the mayor's office to the police chief and so on. So I look forward to working with Carlton, but also trying to assist others across the state as we move forward to some type of resolution. So thank you.
And I would just like to, yes, thank all the delegates for attending and all the phenomenal questions. And I would like to say that, I see this, I really had struggled with, hey, police reform and the intersectionality to environmental climate justice. And I'm still really trying to grapple and deeply understand it. But one thing that is very clear to me is that it's another form, in my view, of creating another pathway to incarcerate our Black and Brown communities. And our communities are in need of what we advocate for in our environmental climate justice program, which is to have the clean energy and the energy efficiency so that we can power up jobs, so that a person can have a livelihood in their communities, and that one should have the right to clean air, clean water, and basically energy democracy. And certainly communities all across Indiana and this nation should not have to host these polluting systems, and we can reimagine better systems, right? Stopping the bad, the militarization, stopping the bad of these extractive economies that take from us, and how we need to reimagine how we can take our community power and move us to the good that we know is possible. And then I would just wrap up to say that the Environmental Climate Justice Committee hopes to, which I have drafted and can share with the committees and with the resolution committee, we've drafted a resolution that was highly written by Carlton Mayor. I said about 75% of it. And I added some other language, which of course I know the resolution committee will help us to shape it even further. And the criminal justice committee can contribute also. And this resolution right now is being titled the Environmental Climate Justice, Fossil Fuels and Criminalization of Our Critical Infrastructures. We also want to pass a transit equity resolution and a resolution on green zones. Recently, we gave testimony at the Indiana 21st Century Energy Policy Task Force, and in our testimony, we called for models like the green zone. And very surprisingly, that committee, the 21st Century, said that, hey, they would be open to a study on the green zones and possible inclusion in the state legislature. So we need our members to begin to write letters and do things that call for these models of green zones, which are basically investments in our communities with clean energy. And then lastly, I will say that there's a lot of fossil fuel systems that are changing from coal to natural gas. This natural gas is, its whole pipeline is impacting our communities. It's leaking natural gas, which has a lot of methane. Methane impacts our health, our air, and methane is one of the major contributors to climate change. And there is a new report out that talks about how cities like Indianapolis are spewing a lot more methane than any other city in the nation. And this is impacting our climate. And we could switch to things like fueling pumps, heating pumps rather, that would reduce our carbon emissions in our homes by 50%, 53% to 68%. And so we want to pass a resolution that talks about how we can electrify our building infrastructures in our homes. We live in old housing stock. Many of us live in houses that have that are heated by natural gas. So these are all the resolutions that we want to pass and all the change that we want to make. And thank you again so much for joining this very important conversation. Thank you. And this will conclude a few minutes early our webinar on the intersections of police reform and environmental climate justice. And thank you, Carlton Mayers and President Anderson, and Frontrunner for running a very phenomenal virtual convening.
Thank you, Denise.